The Boeing 737 sat motionless on the wet runway at exactly 5:42 a.m. while a light spring rain tapped against the cabin windows. The overhead lights were brighter than they needed to be, washing the entire aircraft in the pale glow of an early morning grocery store. Most passengers were still half asleep, clutching coffee cups and boarding passes as they searched for their seats. Shaquille O'Neal wished he could disappear. That was the problem. For most of his life, disappearing had never been an option. Seat 1A had looked acceptable when he booked the flight 3 weeks earlier from a hotel room in Phoenix. It offered extra legroom, early boarding, and most importantly, a chance to avoid attention. Unfortunately, airline websites were designed by people who considered 6 feet tall unusually large. Shaq was 7'1". Reality always arrived at the gate. He turned sideways to move through the aircraft door. He lowered his head to avoid hitting the frame. He carefully folded himself into the first-row seat while trying not to bump the elderly woman across the aisle. Then he spent nearly 30 seconds arranging his knees into a position that would allow circulation to continue reaching his feet. The woman across from him watched the entire process. "So that's how a giant gets on a plane," she said. Shaq smiled politely. He had heard every version of that joke since 1992. The smile stayed. The amusement did not. Once settled, he pulled a faded gray hoodie over his head and leaned toward the window. The hoodie wasn't expensive. It probably cost less than the airport breakfast sandwich sitting untouched in his backpack. It was still his favorite travel accessory, not because it looked good, because it created the illusion of privacy. The fabric blocked eye contact. It discouraged conversations. It allowed strangers to wonder instead of approach. Most importantly, it let him spend a few minutes being a passenger instead of being Shaq. For about 3 minutes it worked. Then a man walking toward row 12 suddenly stopped. "Oh my God." His voice echoed through half the cabin. "It's Shaq." Several heads turned instantly. The man wasn't trying to be rude. He looked genuinely excited. He pulled out his phone before he even reached his assigned seat. Another passenger looked up, then another, then another. The wave traveled through the cabin like a rumor at a family reunion. Shaq kept staring out the window. Maybe they would lose interest. They never did. A young businessman standing near row 4 pretended to check the overhead bins while taking photos. 2 college students whispered back and forth while looking directly at him. Someone near the rear of the plane asked loudly whether he still played basketball. A flight attendant walking by answered before Shaq could. "No, he's retired." The passenger nodded, then immediately asked another question. People rarely saw him. They saw a story they already knew. A famous athlete, a celebrity, a giant, an attraction. Rarely a tired man trying to survive a 6 o'clock flight. The boarding process continued. A woman carrying a designer handbag paused beside row 1. "My husband won't believe this," she said. Without waiting for permission, she snapped a photo. The flash fired. Shaq closed his eyes. The woman walked away completely satisfied with herself. Meanwhile, nobody had asked if he wanted his picture taken. Nobody ever did. At 5:51 a.m., he checked his watch. 9 more minutes until departure. 9 more minutes of pretending not to notice people staring. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man struggled to lift an oversized suitcase into the overhead compartment. Shaq instinctively stood and grabbed the bag with one hand. The suitcase weighed maybe 40 pounds. For him, it felt like a grocery bag. "There you go," Shaq said. The man looked relieved. "Thank you." That interaction lasted exactly 4 seconds. It was the most normal moment of the morning. Shaq sat back down and returned to the window. Rain streaked across the glass. A baggage cart rolled slowly across the tarmac. For a brief moment, nobody looked at him. The silence felt valuable. Then it vanished again. A child several rows back pointed toward the front. "Dad, that's the huge guy from TV." The father immediately corrected him. "That's Shaquille." Then he leaned into the aisle to get a better look himself. Even adults couldn't resist. The hoodie remained pulled low over Shaq's forehead. He wasn't hiding from admiration. He wasn't angry about recognition. He was simply exhausted. There was a difference. Fame looked glamorous from a distance. At 5:56 in the morning on a delayed flight, it mostly felt inconvenient. The cabin door finally closed with a heavy mechanical thud. Passengers settled into their seats. Bags were stored. Phones disappeared. For a few precious seconds, the aircraft became quiet. Shaq exhaled. Maybe now he could get some rest. A sharp voice cut through the silence. "Sir," he didn't move. "Sir, I'm speaking to you." Several passengers turned toward row 1. Shaq slowly lifted his head. A flight attendant stood beside his seat, with her arms folded tightly across her Navy uniform. Her name tag read Clarissa Vance. Her expression suggested she had already decided she didn't like him. The hoodie suddenly felt much thinner. Clarissa glanced at the fabric covering his head, then at the passengers watching nearby. The corners of her mouth tightened, and for reasons Shaq couldn't yet understand, her attention settled on him like a spotlight. Before we continue, have you ever tried to mind your own business, only to become the target because you stood out from everyone else? Comment below, and if you enjoy stories about dignity, respect, and quiet strength, subscribe to the channel for more. Clarissa's attention settled on him like a spotlight. Most flight attendants spent boarding dealing with real problems. Missing bags, wrong seats, passengers trying to sneak oversized luggage onto full flights. Clarissa Vance appeared to have discovered a different mission entirely. She stood beside seat 1A without saying another word, just staring. The silence lasted long enough for nearby passengers to notice. Shaq looked up calmly. "Can I help you?" Clarissa ignored the question. Instead, she pointed directly at his hoodie. "Remove that!" Several heads immediately turned. Shaq blinked. "My hoodie?" "Yes." "The hoodie." Her tone suggested she was ordering someone to drop a weapon. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. The college students from row 4 stopped whispering. Even the elderly woman beside the window seemed curious. Nobody understood why this conversation was happening, including Shaq. "It's just a sweatshirt," he said. Clarissa's jaw tightened. "It prevents proper visual identification." The sentence sounded rehearsed, like something she had been waiting to say all morning. Shaq glanced around the cabin. Several passengers wore baseball caps. One woman had sunglasses resting on her face despite being indoors. A man near row 6 had noise-canceling headphones large enough to communicate with satellites. Nobody else appeared to be causing concern, only him. The realization wasn't new, it rarely was. People often created different rules when a 7-foot man entered the room. "I've already boarded," Shaq said. "You can clearly see who I am." A few passengers chuckled quietly. Clarissa did not. In fact, she looked offended by the laughter. "The issue is compliance." That answer explained everything. Because this was no longer about identification. It was about control. Clarissa possessed a laminated badge, 15 years of seniority, and the absolute confidence of someone who believed every disagreement was an act of rebellion. She wasn't interested in solving a problem. She was interested in winning one. The plane remained parked at the gate. The engines hadn't even started. Yet somehow a gray hoodie had become a national security concern. Shaq rubbed his forehead. He had spent decades dealing with situations exactly like this. The details changed. The people changed. The script stayed surprisingly consistent. Someone decided he looked intimidating. Someone assumed he was difficult. Someone expected resistance before he had spoken 3 words. Then they reacted to the version of him that existed entirely inside their own imagination. A younger Shaq might have argued. A younger Shaq definitely would have made a joke. This morning he was simply tired. Very tired. Clarissa took a small step closer. "Sir, this is your second request. It was your first request." The correction escaped before he could stop it. Several nearby passengers laughed again. A woman near row 3 actually covered her mouth. Clarissa's face turned bright red. Nobody enjoys becoming the punchline, especially people who believe they should be directing the show. "Are you refusing a crew instruction?" Now the entire front section was listening. The question wasn't designed to find an answer. It was designed to create a problem. Shaq recognized the tactic immediately. If he said yes, she had grounds to escalate. If he said no, she could continue pushing until he eventually reacted. Either way, she got the confrontation she wanted. For a moment he considered simply removing the hoodie and ending the conversation. Then he noticed something. Clarissa wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the audience, at the passengers, at the witnesses. This wasn't private correction. This was public performance. The businessman across the aisle slowly lowered his phone after pretending not to record. A flight delay notification chimed somewhere near the rear of the aircraft. Nobody moved. The cabin felt frozen. Clarissa folded her arms tighter. Federal regulations exist for a reason. Shaq glanced toward the cockpit door, then toward the gate visible through the front window, then back at Clarissa. What regulation are we talking about exactly? A dangerous question, not because it was rude, because it required specifics. Specifics are uncomfortable when someone is inventing authority as they go. Clarissa hesitated, only for half a second. But half a second can feel very long when 70 people are watching. Passenger visibility protocols. There was no such phrase, at least not one any airline regularly used. The hesitation told everyone else the same thing. A few passengers exchanged looks. One man shook his head. The elderly woman across the aisle muttered something that sounded suspiciously like nonsense. Clarissa heard it. Her irritation grew. Unfortunately for everyone nearby, irritation was apparently her favorite fuel source. She straightened her uniform jacket. "Remove the hoodie immediately." Her voice rose another level. "Or what?" asked a passenger from row 2 before Shaq could speak. Wrong question. Very wrong question. Because it handed Clarissa the stage. She turned toward the voice dramatically. "Or I will be forced to notify airport authorities regarding a non-compliant passenger creating a potential security concern." Silence. Complete silence. A toddler somewhere in row 14 dropped a toy. The plastic clattered against the floor. Nobody reacted, because everyone was trying to process what they had just heard. Security concern? The man had been sitting quietly staring out a rainy window for 15 minutes. He hadn't argued. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't stood up. His greatest offense appeared to be owning a sweatshirt. The accusation hung awkwardly in the air. Even Clarissa seemed pleased with how serious it sounded. Shaq looked at her for several seconds. Not angry, not intimidated, mostly confused. The situation had crossed into territory usually reserved for bad sitcoms. Yet nobody was laughing now, because once authority enters the conversation, even ridiculous situations become uncomfortable. Clarissa pointed toward the hoodie again. Her fingers stopped inches from his face. "Take it off or get off the plane." The words echoed through the front cabin. There it was, the threat she had wanted from the beginning. Passengers stared. Some looked shocked. Others looked embarrassed for her. A few looked worried. Nobody looked convinced. Shaq slowly leaned back into seat 1A. The rain continued sliding down the window beside him. The engines remained silent. The cabin held its breath. And for the first time that morning, every person on board wondered what the giant in row 1 was going to do next. Shaq slowly leaned back into seat 1A. The rain continued sliding down the window beside him. The engines remained silent. The cabin held its breath. Nobody spoke. Not Clarissa. Not the businessman across the aisle. Not the college students who had been whispering 20 minutes earlier. Everybody was waiting for the same thing, the explosion. It was the version of the story people understood. A famous celebrity gets publicly embarrassed. A powerful ego gets challenged. The giant gets angry, voices rise. Phones come out. Someone ends up on social media before the plane even leaves the gate. That was the movie everyone expected. Clarissa certainly expected it. Why else would she keep standing there? Why else would she repeat the threat in front of half the cabin? She wanted resistance. Resistance justified escalation. Escalation justified authority. Authority justified everything else. The formula was simple. Unfortunately for her, Shaquille O'Neal had lived through too many versions of that formula. He had experienced it in arenas, in restaurants, in hotels, in airports, in elevators. Sometimes people challenged him because they wanted attention, sometimes because they wanted control, sometimes because they simply couldn't believe a man his size could exist without causing trouble. The reason changed. The pattern never did. Shaq looked out the window again. A baggage worker in a reflective vest was guiding equipment across the rain-soaked tarmac. The man seemed completely unconcerned with airline drama. Lucky guy. Clarissa cleared her throat. "Sir?" The word sounded less confident now. Not because she doubted herself, because her audience was growing impatient. The confrontation wasn't progressing according to schedule. Shaq finally turned his head. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no anger in his expression. That seemed to bother her even more. People who want conflict become frustrated when nobody joins them. "Do you understand my instruction?" she asked. "I heard you. Then comply." Several passengers visibly winced. The tone wasn't necessary. That was becoming increasingly obvious. A woman near row 3 shook her head. The elderly passenger across the aisle folded her arms. Even a man who had spent most of boarding pretending not to pay attention now looked openly annoyed. The mood inside the cabin was changing, not toward outrage, toward discomfort. People were beginning to feel like witnesses, and witnesses make authority figures nervous. Clarissa sensed it too, which explained why she doubled down. She stepped slightly closer. Failure to follow crew instructions can result in removal from the aircraft. There it was again, the threat, same message, different packaging. Shaq almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it reminded him of something his stepfather used to say. When Shaq was growing up, Philip Harrison had no patience for emotional outbursts. The military sergeant who helped raise him believed discipline mattered more than pride, especially wounded pride. One lesson remained with Shaq decades later. Never give difficult people exactly what they want. At the time, teenage Shaq hated hearing it. At 54 years old, sitting on an airplane before sunrise, it suddenly seemed like excellent advice. Clarissa wanted a reaction, a refusal, an argument, a headline, anything that justified the scene she had created. Shaq wasn't interested in helping. The businessman across the aisle quietly lowered his phone. A flight attendant farther back glanced toward the front cabin. Even she looked confused. Nobody seemed certain why this had become a major event, because it shouldn't have been. It was a hoodie, a gray hoodie. Nothing more, nothing less. The entire situation felt ridiculous, and that was exactly why it was dangerous. Ridiculous situations often lure people into making emotional decisions. The more absurd something becomes, the more tempting it is to fight back. Shaq understood that trap. He had walked into it before. Years ago, too many years ago. Not today. He reached up with one enormous hand. The movement was slow, deliberate. The cabin immediately grew even quieter. Passengers leaned forward. Somebody stopped opening a bag of pretzels. Even Clarissa seemed surprised. Perhaps she expected another argument. Perhaps she expected resistance at the final moment. Instead, Shaq simply grabbed the edge of the hood. Then he pulled it back. The gray fabric slid behind his neck. Nothing dramatic happened. No speech, no protest, no sarcastic remark, no celebrity lecture about respect. Just a man removing a sweatshirt. The simplicity of it landed harder than any argument could have. Clarissa blinked. Her victory arrived so easily that she almost didn't know what to do with it. For a second she just stood there, waiting, expecting something else. A complaint, a challenge, a final shot. Instead, Shaq turned back toward the window. That was all. The giant she had spent 10 minutes provoking had responded with less emotion than someone returning a shopping cart. The rain continued falling outside. A small stream of water crawled down the glass. The plane remained exactly where it had been. The world kept moving. Clarissa's expression tightened. Because suddenly there was no battle left to win. The weapon she had been using no longer existed. The confrontation depended on conflict. Shaq had removed it. Passengers exchanged glances. The elderly woman across the aisle smiled faintly. One of the college students quietly whispered something to his friend. The friend nodded. Nobody looked impressed by Clarissa. That may have been the most frustrating part. Public victories are only satisfying when the public actually celebrates them. This audience wasn't celebrating. They were evaluating, and their conclusions were becoming increasingly obvious. Clarissa adjusted her uniform jacket, then smoothed an imaginary wrinkle, then checked the overhead bins, then looked around as though searching for another task. Anything to recover momentum. Anything to regain control of the room. Unfortunately, control had already slipped away. Not because Shaq challenged her. Because he didn't. People expected strength to look loud. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like a man refusing to hand over his dignity in exchange for a temporary feeling of satisfaction. Clarissa finally turned toward the aisle. Without another word, she walked away from row 1. The tension moved with her. Passengers gradually relaxed. Conversations resumed. Phones disappeared. Someone laughed quietly about something unrelated. The aircraft slowly returned to normal, or at least it tried to. Because as Clarissa marched down the narrow aisle, searching for somewhere else to direct her authority, her eyes landed on a fragile old man in row 8 holding a polished oak box carefully against his chest. And something about that sight immediately caught her attention. Clarissa slowed her pace as she approached row 8. The old man wasn't bothering anyone. He wasn't standing in the aisle. He wasn't arguing with crew members. He wasn't violating any obvious airline policy. He was simply sitting quietly by the window, holding a polished oak box against his chest with both hands. Most people would have walked right past him. Clarissa stopped. A few rows behind her, passengers noticed immediately. People had been watching her ever since the confrontation with Shaq. Not openly, just enough to see where she would go next. The answer, apparently, was row 8. The old man looked up as her shadow crossed his seat. His face carried the weathered look of someone who had spent decades working with his hands. Deep lines framed his eyes, gray hair curled around his ears. A faded denim jacket hung loosely over his thin frame. He looked tired. Not airport tired, life tired. His boarding pass rested neatly inside the seatback pocket. Everything about him suggested a man who followed rules. Clarissa stared at the oak box. "What is that?" The old man blinked. "Excuse me?" "The box." Her tone was sharp enough to cut paper. "What is it?" The man glanced down. "Oh." His expression softened slightly. "It's personal." That answer should have ended the conversation. It didn't. Clarissa crossed her arms. Personal items still need to comply with airline regulations. The old man nodded politely. "Of course." Then he returned his attention to the box. Clarissa remained standing there, waiting. The silence became awkward. Finally, the man extended a hand. "Arthur Pendleton." Clarissa ignored it completely. Arthur slowly lowered his hand again. Several passengers nearby noticed. Nobody said anything. The cabin had entered that strange social territory where everyone recognized rude behavior but hoped somebody else would deal with it. Clarissa pointed directly at the box. "Place it in the overhead compartment." Arthur looked genuinely confused. "It's staying with me." "It cannot remain on your lap during departure." The old man adjusted his grip. His fingers tightened around the polished wood. "It'll fit under the seat." Clarissa immediately shook her head. "No." Arthur frowned. The answer arrived too quickly, almost like she had already decided before he spoke. A woman seated across the aisle glanced over her book. A young man wearing headphones removed one ear cup. The tension was spreading again, not loud, just enough. Arthur attempted a small smile. "I've flown with it before. I don't care." The words landed harder than Clarissa intended, at least harder than she realized. Several passengers exchanged looks. Arthur looked down for a moment. Not embarrassed, more surprised. People usually become nicer around older individuals. Clarissa appeared to be moving in the opposite direction. The old machinist cleared his throat. "Ma'am, it isn't hurting anyone." Clarissa took another step closer. "That isn't the issue." Arthur waited. So did everyone else, because nobody knew what the issue actually was. Clarissa pointed again. "The item appears heavy." Arthur looked at the box, then back at her. "It's not that heavy. Weight restrictions exist for safety reasons." Arthur nodded. "Then weigh it." That answer generated a few quiet chuckles nearby. Clarissa did not appreciate them, not at all. The irritation from row 1 was returning. Passengers could almost see it rebuilding itself. The problem wasn't the box. The problem was that she kept running into people who remained calm. Calm people are difficult to control. Arthur shifted slightly in his seat. The movement revealed a small brass plate attached to the side of the oak box. Clarissa immediately noticed. "What does that say?" Arthur hesitated, only briefly, but long enough. His thumb moved across the brass plate, almost protectively. Nothing important. Now Clarissa was interested. The curiosity wasn't kind, it felt investigative, like a police officer convinced a crime existed somewhere and simply needed to find it. She leaned closer. "I need to inspect the contents." Arthur's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The first genuine discomfort appeared. "No." The answer arrived quietly. Clarissa's eyebrows lifted. "No?" "No, ma'am." The surrounding rows became silent again. Passengers sensed something important without understanding why. Arthur wasn't being argumentative. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't challenging authority. He was protecting something. The difference mattered. At least to everyone except Clarissa. She straightened. "Sir, refusal to cooperate creates additional concerns." Arthur sighed softly. The sound carried the exhaustion of someone who had attended too many funerals and filled out too many forms. At 68, he had learned something valuable. Most arguments aren't won, they're survived. I promise there's nothing dangerous inside. Clarissa smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who believed every conversation had winners and losers. Then you won't mind showing me. Arthur looked at the box again. The cabin watched. The businessman from row 4 leaned slightly into the aisle. The college students had completely abandoned any attempt to appear uninterested. Even passengers farther back were beginning to notice. The atmosphere felt wrong, like watching someone kick at a locked door after discovering it won't open. Arthur's hands tightened. For the first time, they began to tremble. Not dramatically, just enough for the polished wood to shift slightly against his jacket. Clarissa noticed immediately and misread it completely. To her, nervousness meant suspicion. To everyone else, it looked like pain. The old man swallowed. Please. One word, nothing more. Yet it carried more weight than every threat Clarissa had made all morning. Passengers heard it. Some lowered their eyes. Others looked directly at Clarissa, waiting to see whether she would finally leave the man alone. Instead, she pointed toward the front of the aircraft. Last warning. Arthur stared at her. Either place that box in the overhead compartment, her voice grew louder, or surrender it for checked baggage. The old man's face lost color. His hands shook harder now, and for the first time since boarding, several passengers realized this wasn't about airline procedure anymore. Something inside that box mattered enough to break a man's heart, and Clarissa was seconds away from finding out exactly what it was. Arthur lowered his eyes toward the polished oak box resting against his chest. For a moment, he didn't speak. The cabin remained quiet. Nobody rushed him. Nobody interrupted. Even passengers who had spent the last 20 minutes pretending not to pay attention were now fully invested, because whatever was inside that box clearly mattered. A lot. Arthur slowly ran his thumb across the brass plate attached to the wood. The movement looked practiced, familiar, like something he had done thousands of times before. Then he looked up. His voice came out soft. "My wife is inside." Clarissa frowned. Several passengers exchanged confused glances. Arthur swallowed. Ashes. The word seemed to drain all sound from the surrounding rows. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The businessman across the aisle lowered his gaze immediately. The college students stopped whispering. Even the woman with the novel quietly closed the book in her lap. Everything suddenly made sense. Arthur gently rested his hand on the box. Her name was Miriam. The old man smiled faintly. Not because he was happy, because memories sometimes arrive before sadness catches them. We were married 43 years. His eyes drifted toward the window. She still beat me at cards. A few passengers smiled despite themselves. Arthur nodded slightly. Cheated too. That earned a couple quiet laughs. For the first time all morning, the tension loosened. Just a little. Arthur seemed grateful for that. She passed away 6 months ago. The smiles disappeared. The reality settled heavily across the cabin. Outside, rain continued streaking across the windows. Inside, nobody seemed interested in anything except the old man speaking from row 8. Arthur carefully adjusted the box. She wanted to come home slightly. This flight is part of that trip. Clarissa remained standing, expressionless, waiting. Arthur looked up at her. I know it sounds foolish. It doesn't, said a woman across the aisle. Arthur glanced toward her and offered a thankful nod. Then he turned back to Clarissa. I just can't put her in an overhead bin. The sentence landed hard, not dramatic, not theatrical, just honest. The kind of honesty that makes strangers suddenly feel uncomfortable for having witnessed it. Arthur looked down again. I spent 43 years trying not to lose her. Nobody laughed this time. I'd rather not start now. The cabin became silent once more. The story should have ended there. Any reasonable person would have let it end there. Clarissa didn't. Her jaw tightened. Sir, airline regulations don't make exceptions for sentimental value. Several passengers visibly reacted. Not because the statement was technically wrong, because it sounded heartless. The timing made it worse. Arthur blinked, almost as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. I understand, then comply. There it was again. The same word, the same obsession, compliance, control, authority. Passengers were beginning to notice the pattern. Clarissa wasn't listening. She was processing. Everything became a procedure. Every person became a problem. Arthur inhaled slowly. His hands trembled more noticeably now. Arthritis had already twisted several fingers on his right hand. The effort required to grip the box was becoming obvious. Still, he held on. "I'll keep it secured." "No, it fits safely beneath the seat." "No, I'll hold it during takeoff." "No." Every answer arrived before the sentence finished. Like Clarissa wasn't hearing him anymore. The businessman finally spoke. "Come on." Clarissa immediately turned toward him. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. It concerns everyone now." A few nearby passengers nodded. The mood in the cabin was changing again. Not toward anger, toward disbelief. People couldn't understand why the situation continued. The old man wasn't dangerous, the box wasn't dangerous, the conversation itself had become the problem. Arthur shifted uncomfortably. Then something unexpected happened. He reached into his jacket pocket. Clarissa immediately stiffened. Arthur pulled out a worn leather wallet, nothing more. He opened it carefully. Several photographs slipped into view. Old photographs. The kind people carry for years, the kind with softened edges. Arthur removed one. A smiling woman stood beside him in front of a lake. Both looked decades younger. Miriam. He held the picture toward Clarissa. For a moment she didn't take it. Eventually she glanced at it, briefly, then handed it back. No reaction, no acknowledgement, nothing. Arthur carefully returned the photograph to his wallet. "I can buy another ticket." The sentence surprised everyone. Arthur looked completely serious. "I still have my credit card." His voice trembled. "Charge me for the seat." Nobody laughed, because nobody thought he was joking. Arthur was negotiating with grief, trying to find a price for dignity, trying to protect the last thing he had left. Clarissa shook her head. "That's not how airline seating works." Arthur nodded. "I figured." Then he looked down at the box again. The silence that followed felt painful. Passengers avoided eye contact. Several people suddenly became very interested in their shoes. Not because they didn't care, because they cared too much. Watching grief is uncomfortable. Watching someone argue with grief is worse. Clarissa glanced toward the overhead bins, then toward the front of the aircraft. Her patience appeared exhausted. "We're done discussing this." Arthur's fingers tightened immediately. Every muscle in his body seemed to understand what those words meant. Clarissa extended her hand. "Give me the box." Arthur froze. The entire cabin froze with him. "No." The answer came out barely above a whisper. Clarissa moved closer. "Sir, no." His voice broke. Not from fear, from desperation. The kind of desperation people hear only a few times in life. Arthur pulled the box tighter against his chest. The movement looked instinctive, protective, almost parental. Clarissa reached forward. One hand grabbed the side of the oak box. Arthur gasped. Several passengers shouted simultaneously. "Hey! Stop! What are you doing?" Arthur held on. Clarissa pulled. The old man's arthritic fingers slipped against the polished wood. For one terrible second, it looked like the box might fall. Arthur's entire body shook. "Please." The word cracked apart as it left his mouth. "Please don't." Clarissa pulled harder, and then the floor beneath several passengers vibrated. A deep metallic thump echoed through the cabin. Not from the aircraft. From someone standing up. Someone very large. Someone who had remained silent long enough. And every head in the plane immediately turned toward row 1. The sound itself wasn't dramatic. Just a seatbelt releasing. A simple metallic click. Yet somehow it carried through the cabin, louder than Clarissa's voice had all morning. Arthur's trembling hands remained locked around the oak box. Clarissa still had one hand gripping the side. Neither moved, because suddenly neither of them was the center of attention anymore. The focus had shifted, completely. Shaquille O'Neal stood up. The movement seemed to happen in slow motion, partly because of his size, partly because nobody could believe he had remained seated this long. The businessman near row 4 stopped pretending to check his phone. The college students leaned into the aisle. A woman several rows back quietly whispered one sentence. "Oh boy." Not because Shaq looked angry, because nobody knew what came next. For the past 30 minutes, the giant in seat 1A had behaved like the calmest person on the aircraft. That calm had become almost unsettling. People understand shouting, people understand arguments, people understand visible anger. Silence is harder to predict, especially when it belongs to a 7'1" former NBA superstar. Shaq stepped into the aisle. The aircraft suddenly felt much smaller. Airplanes are designed around average-sized people. Shaq had never been average-sized. The overhead compartments seemed lower, the aisle seemed narrower. The distance between rows seemed absurdly optimistic. He turned sideways to move forward. One careful step, then another, then another. The floor vibrated slightly beneath his weight. Not enough to shake the aircraft, just enough for passengers to feel it. A rhythmic sensation traveled through the cabin. Nobody spoke. Nobody even pretended not to watch anymore. At 5:58 a.m., 140 passengers became spectators. Clarissa noticed him approaching. For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared on her face. Just briefly. A flicker. Then it disappeared. Authority can survive disagreement. Authority struggles with doubt. She released the box immediately. Arthur pulled it back against his chest. Relief flooded across the old man's face. Not because the situation was over, because at least the box was safe. For now, Clarissa straightened her shoulders. Perhaps she expected confrontation. Perhaps she expected a celebrity speech. Perhaps she expected cameras. Everyone seemed to expect something. Shaq kept walking, no hurry, no dramatic gestures, no clenched fists. The calmness made the moment heavier. A loud person announces their intentions. A quiet person leaves people guessing. The woman with the novel closed it completely. The businessman locked his phone screen. A flight attendant near row 11 froze beside a beverage cart. Even passengers who couldn't see the front leaned into the aisle trying to understand why the entire cabin had gone silent. Shaq stopped beside row 6, then continued forward. Clarissa's posture became increasingly rigid, like someone preparing for impact. The irony wasn't lost on the passengers. For 20 minutes she had acted like Shaq was a threat. Now she was the one looking nervous. Arthur sat motionless, the oak box rested firmly against his chest. His eyes followed Shaq's approach. There was gratitude there, but something else too, concern. Arthur didn't want to fight. The last thing he wanted was another person suffering because of him, especially someone trying to help. A little voice inside him seemed to be saying the same thing over and over. Please don't make this worse. Please don't get yourself into trouble. Please don't turn this into something bigger. Unfortunately, bigger had already arrived. Shaq reached row 7, then row 8. Passengers instinctively moved their knees out of the aisle, not because he demanded space, because his presence naturally created it. The atmosphere changed around him, the way weather changes before a storm. Not dangerous, just undeniable. Clarissa looked up, then up a little, farther than all the way up. She wasn't a small woman. Yet standing beside Shaq created a visual contrast nobody could ignore. The power dynamic she had carefully built all morning suddenly looked different. Authority on paper is one thing. Authority in reality is another. The cabin felt that difference immediately. Still, Shaq said nothing. That silence was becoming its own form of communication. Clarissa cleared her throat. "Sir, return to your seat." No response. Passengers must remain seated during boarding procedures. Still nothing. A few passengers exchanged glances. Interesting, because nobody remembered Clarissa being particularly concerned about rules when she was trying to remove an urn from a grieving widower. The inconsistency was becoming noticeable, very noticeable. Shaq finally reached Arthur's row. Then he stopped, directly, behind Clarissa. The difference in size was almost comical. Passengers near the aisle could barely see her anymore. The giant simply occupied too much space. Clarissa's shoulders tightened. She was no longer controlling the room, she knew it. Everyone else knew it too. Yet Shaq still hadn't spoken a single word. That bothered her more than shouting ever could. People who thrive on conflict need engagement. Without engagement, their script falls apart. Clarissa tried again. "Sir, I'm giving you a direct instruction." Nothing. The engines outside finally began their low startup sequence. A faint vibration traveled through the aircraft. Yet somehow the cabin remained focused entirely on row 8. Arthur looked from Clarissa to Shaq, then back again. The contrast was impossible to miss. One person had spent half an hour exercising authority. The other had spent half an hour exercising restraint. Passengers were drawing their own conclusions. Clarissa sensed it. Her confidence continued leaking away, not all at once, a little at a time, like air escaping a tire. Then something happened that nobody expected. Shaq stepped slightly to the side, not toward Clarissa, toward Arthur. His attention never settled on the flight attendant at all. It settled on the old man, on the shaking hands, on the polished oak box, on the grief sitting quietly in row 8, and in that instant everyone realized something important. Shaq had not left his seat to challenge Clarissa. He had left his seat because Arthur was hurting. The distinction changed everything. And before Clarissa could decide what to do next, the giant began lowering himself into the cramped aisle beside the widower. The movement looked almost impossible. 7'1" men were not designed for commercial airplanes. Every seat corner, armrest, and tray table seemed determined to remind him of that fact. Yet somehow Shaq lowered himself carefully onto one knee without bumping a single passenger. The cabin watched in complete silence. Nobody had expected this. Not Clarissa, not Arthur, not the passengers who had spent the last 10 minutes anticipating some kind of confrontation. Instead of becoming larger, Shaq somehow made himself smaller. That was the first surprise. The second was where he directed his attention. Not at Clarissa, not at the growing audience, not at the phones that were quietly appearing throughout the cabin. His eyes remained fixed on Arthur. The old man's hands were still shaking. The oak box rested awkwardly against his chest. Arthur looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone who had spent the last few minutes defending something sacred from people who couldn't understand why it mattered. Shaq spoke for the first time since leaving row 1. His voice was low, soft enough that passengers leaned forward to hear it. "You okay?" Arthur blinked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. After everything that had happened, nobody had asked how he was doing. They had questioned him, ordered him, corrected him, threatened him, but nobody had asked if he was okay. Arthur swallowed, then nodded. Mostly. That was all he managed. Mostly, Shaq understood. Some days that was the best answer available. Without another word, he gently placed one hand over Arthur's trembling fingers. The size difference was remarkable. Arthur's entire hand disappeared beneath Shaq's. Yet there was nothing intimidating about it, nothing aggressive. The gesture felt protective, like someone steadying a ladder, or holding a door open, or helping a stranger across an icy sidewalk. Simple, human. The shaking gradually stopped. Arthur looked down, then up again. His eyes were suddenly wet, not because of what Shaq had done, because of what he hadn't done. He hadn't demanded explanations, he hadn't asked questions, he hadn't treated grief like evidence, he had simply recognized it. Passengers noticed too. The businessman from row 4 quietly removed his glasses. The woman with the novel stared at her lap. Even the college students looked uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable that happens when people realize they should have spoken sooner. Clarissa, meanwhile, looked furious. The situation had escaped her completely. Every minute made it worse. "Sir!" Her voice cut through the silence. Shaq didn't respond. Clarissa stepped closer. "I need you to return to your assigned seat immediately." Still nothing. Not even a glance. Passengers exchanged looks. Ignoring someone is surprisingly powerful, especially when that person desperately wants attention. Clarissa tried again. "Ladies and gentlemen, federal regulations require passengers." Nobody listened, because the speech wasn't aimed at passengers. It was aimed at Shaq, and Shaq had already made a decision. Arthur felt the giant hand still resting lightly on his own, steady, unhurried. Present. The old machinist hadn't felt particularly strong since Miriam died. There were too many empty rooms, too many silent mornings, too many habits with nowhere to go. For 6 months he had carried conversations inside his head because the person he wanted to speak to wasn't there anymore. Then somehow a stranger on an airplane had made him feel less alone in under 30 seconds. Life was strange that way. Clarissa stepped around them, attempting to regain position, attempting to reclaim authority, attempting to become the center of the room again. Shaq calmly shifted, not aggressively, not suddenly, just enough. His broad shoulder moved between Arthur and Clarissa. The result was immediate. The flight attendant could no longer reach the old man. Passengers noticed instantly, so did Clarissa. Her expression darkened. "Move." Shaq didn't. "Sir, move." Still nothing. The giant remained exactly where he was, not blocking the aisle, not threatening anyone, simply occupying the space between a grieving widower and a person determined to make his day worse. The distinction mattered. A lot. Arthur glanced up at him. "You don't have to do this." Shaq finally smiled. The first real smile of the morning. "Yeah." He shrugged slightly. "I kind of do." Several passengers laughed quiet. The tension loosened for a moment. Just enough, Arthur shook his head. You don't even know me. Shaq nodded. True. Then he looked at the oak box. Still doesn't seem right. That was it. No speech about respect, no lecture about humanity, no dramatic declaration, just one ordinary observation. Still doesn't seem right. The simplicity made it stronger. Because everybody knew exactly what he meant. Clarissa folded her arms. You are interfering with airline operations. A man from row 5 spoke up immediately. No, he's helping. Another passenger nodded. Then another, then another. The momentum shifted, slowly at first, then all at once. People who had remained silent began finding their voices. The businessman spoke. The woman with the novel spoke. Even the elderly passenger from row 1 joined in. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. They simply stated what they had seen. That alone was enough. Clarissa looked around. The audience she had spent the morning performing for was no longer on her side. For the first time, uncertainty became visible. Real uncertainty. Not annoyance. Not frustration. Doubt. The cabin no longer felt like her workplace. It felt like a room full of witnesses. Shaq gently guided Arthur's hands back around the oak box, making sure it rested securely against the old man's chest. Then he settled slightly deeper into his kneeling position. His broad back now completely faced Clarissa. The effect was immediate. Arthur disappeared behind him. Not entirely. Just enough. Enough that Clarissa couldn't reach him. Couldn't intimidate him. Couldn't even make eye contact if she tried. The giant had become a wall. Not a threatening wall, a protective one. Muscle, bone, patience, compassion. Everything Clarissa had been unable to move all morning. And just like that, she became the least important person in the entire situation. For a few stunned seconds, nobody knew what to do next. Then Clarissa reached for the wall intercom near the front galley, and the look in her eyes told several passengers she was about to make the situation far worse. Clarissa spun away from row 8 and marched toward the forward galley. The movement was fast. Too fast. People make quick decisions when they're angry. They make dangerous decisions when they're embarrassed. Clarissa was both. Passengers watched her grab the wall intercom mounted beside the service station. The device was intended for communication. Unfortunately, communication and retaliation sometimes look similar from a distance. She pressed the button. The sharp electronic click echoed through the cabin. Several passengers immediately exchanged nervous glances. Nobody liked where this was heading, especially not the other flight attendants. One younger crew member standing near row 10 seemed alarmed. She started walking forward, then stopped, then looked away. Airline hierarchy can be complicated. Correcting a senior flight attendant in front of passengers is rarely encouraged. Clarissa knew that. She also knew nobody was likely to challenge her publicly. The intercom crackled. Flight deck. The captain's voice sounded calm, routine, professional, unaware. Clarissa inhaled sharply. Then she changed the story, completely. We have a hostile passenger situation. The cabin froze. Every head turned. Arthur looked up. Shaq slowly shifted his gaze toward the galley. Even passengers in the rear sections leaned into the aisle. Hostile passenger? What hostile passenger? Everyone on board knew exactly what had happened. Everyone had watched it. Yet somehow the story coming through the intercom sounded like it belonged to a different flight. Clarissa continued. The individual has refused crew instructions repeatedly. Passengers stared. He has physically interfered with airline operations. More staring. He has created a threatening environment for passengers and staff. The silence became uncomfortable, not because people believed her, because they didn't. The disconnect between reality and her version of events was becoming impossible to ignore. Arthur looked genuinely horrified, not for himself, for Shaq. The old machinist understood something many people didn't. Systems tend to listen to authority first. Questions often arrive later. Clarissa tightened her grip on the intercom. I am requesting immediate intervention. The captain's voice returned, this time slower. Clarissa, clarify the situation. For the first time all morning, somebody was asking for details. Unfortunately, details were not Clarissa's friend. She hesitated, only briefly, then committed fully. The passenger became physically aggressive while obstructing crew duties. Several people gasped. The businessman from row 4 actually stood halfway out of his seat. What? A woman near row 6 looked completely stunned. That's not true. Others began murmuring. The noise spread rapidly. because there is something uniquely unsettling about watching a lie become official. The intercom clicked off. Clarissa lowered the microphone. The cabin buzzed with anxious conversation. Nobody seemed sure what would happen next, except Shaq. He remained kneeling beside Arthur, still calm, still quiet, still focused on the old man. That somehow made the situation even stranger. Most people would have jumped to their feet. Most people would have defended themselves immediately. Most people would have argued. Shaq simply stayed where he was. Arthur looked at him nervously. "You should say something." Shaq glanced down, then smiled faintly. "I think everybody already saw." Arthur wasn't so sure, because seeing and deciding aren't always the same thing. Outside the aircraft, rain continued falling. Ground crews moved equipment across the tarmac. The ordinary world kept functioning. Inside the cabin, everything felt suspended, like the flight itself had paused. Minutes passed, long minutes, the kind that feel longer because nobody knows what comes next. Passengers checked their watches, looked toward the front door, looked toward the cockpit, then looked back at Shaq. Nobody returned to normal conversation. Nobody opened laptops. Nobody resumed reading books. The entire aircraft had become one giant waiting room. At exactly 6:03 a.m., movement appeared outside the forward cabin window. Two figures. Dark uniforms, purposeful strides. Several passengers noticed immediately. The murmuring stopped. The businessman saw them first, then the woman with the novel, then nearly everyone else. The figures moved up the jet bridge, fast, professional, deliberate. Arthur followed everyone's gaze. His stomach dropped, the oak box tightened against his chest. "No." The word escaped before he realized he had spoken. Shaq looked toward the front door, still calm, still unreadable. The younger flight attendant near row 10 looked pale now. Whatever she believed earlier, she clearly understood the situation had escalated beyond airline customer service. The aircraft door opened. A rush of cool morning air entered the cabin. Then came the sound. Heavy boots. Firm. Measured. Authoritative. Every passenger recognized it immediately. Law enforcement. The two men entering weren't airport employees. They weren't gate agents. They weren't airline supervisors. They were federal air marshals, dark jackets, professional posture, focused expressions. The atmosphere changed instantly, not because they looked threatening, because everyone understood the stakes. A disagreement with a flight attendant was one thing. Federal intervention was something else entirely. The lead marshal scanned the cabin. Years of training showed in the movement, quick observations, controlled breathing, assessing threats, gathering information. His partner remained slightly behind him. Neither man appeared excited, neither appeared aggressive. Rarely do. Clarissa immediately stepped forward. Relief flooded across her face. Reinforcements had arrived. At least that was what she believed. She began speaking rapidly, pointing toward row 8, gesturing toward Shaq, explaining, building her narrative. The marshals listened without interruption. Passengers watched nervously. Arthur looked sick. Several rows back, a young woman in nursing school quietly unlocked her phone. The screen illuminated in her hands. Nobody noticed. Not yet. The lead marshal finally nodded. Then he looked down the aisle toward row 8. His eyes settled on Shaq, on Arthur, on the oak box, on the dozens of passengers staring back at him. The cabin became completely silent. Not a cough, not a whisper, not even the sound of a seatbelt moving. 140 people waited to see which version of the story would matter. The one Clarissa had just told, or the one everyone else had witnessed. The lead air marshal took a slow step into the cabin, then another. His partner remained near the aircraft door, quietly observing the passengers. Neither man appeared eager to act. That alone surprised several people. Television teaches people that law enforcement arrives with dramatic speeches and immediate conclusions. Reality usually moves slower. The lead marshal looked at Clarissa, then at Shaq, then at Arthur, then at the dozens of passengers watching the situation unfold. Experience had taught him something important. When an entire room looks uncomfortable, there is usually more to the story. Clarissa continued talking. Too fast. The words practically collided with each other. He refused instructions. He interfered with crew operations. He intimidated staff. He became physically confrontational. The marshal listened patiently. The problem was that nobody else in the cabin seemed to agree. Passengers exchanged looks. Several shook their heads. The contradiction was becoming impossible to hide. Arthur sat frozen. The oak box remained secured against his chest. His eyes moved between the marshals and Clarissa. He looked exhausted, like a man who had aged 5 years during a 30-minute delay. Shaq remained kneeling beside him, still calm, still silent, still refusing to make the situation about himself. The lead marshal finally spoke. "Sir!" He looked directly at Shaq. "Can you tell me what happened?" Every passenger waited. Shaq glanced toward Arthur, then back toward the marshal. She tried taking his box. That was it. No speech. No accusations, no attempt to defend himself. Just one sentence. Simple, accurate, complete. The marshal nodded, then looked at Arthur. So Arthur swallowed. Yes, his voice sounded small, but steady. The marshal nodded again. Then he turned back toward Clarissa. Something about the interaction seemed to frustrate her. Perhaps because neither man was behaving like a threat. Perhaps because neither man was helping her version of events. She immediately stepped forward. "They are minimizing what happened." That sentence finally triggered something in the cabin. Not anger. Action. A young woman in seat 9B slowly stood up. Most passengers hadn't noticed her earlier. 24 years old. Brown ponytail. Blue scrubs beneath a light jacket. Nursing student. Quiet the entire flight. The type of person people often overlook until they stop overlooking them. "Excuse me." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The cabin was already silent. Every head turned. The marshal looked at her. "Yes, ma'am?" The young woman held up her phone. "I recorded part of it." The words hit the cabin like a switch being flipped. Several passengers immediately nodded. Others visibly relaxed. Because evidence changes everything. Opinions argue. Facts don't. Clarissa's face lost color. Not dramatically. Just enough. The nursing student stepped into the aisle. "I started recording when she threatened to remove him from the plane." Nobody needed clarification regarding who she meant. The marshal accepted the phone. "Thank you." The young woman nodded. "My professor says documentation matters." A few passengers smiled despite the tension. The nursing student shrugged slightly. Turns out she was right. The lead marshal tapped the screen. The video began playing. Passengers couldn't hear every detail, but they didn't need to. The expressions alone told the story. Clarissa demanding compliance. Arthur explaining. Clarissa reaching for the box. Arthur pulling away. The visible distress. The shaking hands. The pleading. Then Shaq, calm, silent, protective. Nothing aggressive. Nothing threatening. Nothing remotely matching the report Clarissa had provided. The video lasted 45 seconds. It felt much longer. The marshal watched the entire recording, then watched it again. His partner moved closer. Together they reviewed the footage. Neither spoke. Neither reacted visibly. Professionals rarely do. That somehow made the silence more intimidating. Passengers waited. Arthur waited. Clarissa waited. The nursing student stood quietly beside her seat. Shaq remained kneeling. The entire aircraft seemed suspended between two outcomes. Then the lead marshal handed the phone back. "Thank you." The nursing student returned to her seat. The marshal turned slowly. Not toward Shaq, not toward Arthur. Toward Clarissa. For the first time all morning, she looked uncertain. Truly uncertain. The kind that reaches the eyes. The marshal's voice remained calm. "Did you report that this passenger physically threatened you?" Clarissa hesitated, only briefly. "Yes." The marshal nodded. "And did you report that he interfered with airline operations?" Another hesitation. "Yes." The marshal glanced toward Shaq, then toward Arthur, then back at Clarissa. "We observed no evidence of either claim." The cabin remained silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Not now. The partner marshal folded his arms. The lead marshal continued. "The video shows a passenger protecting another passenger." Clarissa opened her mouth, then closed it. The words never arrived because there wasn't much left to say. Passengers had seen everything. The recording had captured everything. Reality had become difficult to negotiate. The businessman from Vrofer quietly leaned back into his seat. The woman with the novel reopened her book. People were beginning to relax, not because the situation was over, because truth had finally entered the room. The lead marshal extended one arm toward the aircraft door. A simple gesture. Nothing dramatic, no shouting, no humiliation, no speech, just a direction. Clarissa stared at him. The realization arrived slowly. Then all at once, the instruction wasn't for Shaq. It wasn't for Arthur. It was for her. The partner marshal stepped aside, creating a clear path toward the exit. Passengers watched. Nobody celebrated. Nobody clapped. This wasn't victory. It was correction, a necessary difference. Clarissa looked around the cabin, perhaps searching for support, perhaps searching for agreement, perhaps searching for someone who still believed her story. She found none, not one. The audience she had tried to control all morning had become witnesses instead, and witnesses can be inconvenient, especially when they tell the truth. Without another word, Clarissa picked up her tablet and walked toward the aircraft door. The partner marshal followed. A few seconds later, both disappeared into the jet bridge. The cabin remained silent. Then somebody exhaled. Then somebody laughed nervously. Then conversation slowly returned. Life resumed. The lead marshal remained behind for a moment longer. He looked toward Arthur, then toward Shaq, then at the oak box resting safely between them. A faint smile appeared, small, respectful, knowing. And for the first time that morning, the atmosphere inside the airplane felt lighter than the rain clouds waiting outside. The remaining flight attendant completed the safety demonstration. The aircraft finally pushed back from the gate. Passengers settled into their seats. Conversations gradually returned. Normal life resumed, or at least something close to normal. Arthur remained quiet for most of the flight. The oak box never left his hands. Not during takeoff, not during the beverage service, not during the occasional turbulence over Indiana. The polished wood rested securely against his chest the entire journey. Nobody questioned it again. Nobody even looked twice. Sometimes people only need one reminder to act like human beings. Shaq eventually returned to seat 1A after the marshals left. The walk back drew far less attention than the walk down. That seemed fitting. The biggest moment of the flight had been created by someone choosing not to make it about himself. Passengers occasionally nodded toward him during the trip. A few quietly thanked him while walking to the restroom. One older woman slipped a folded napkin into his hand while exiting the aircraft. Inside were 4 words: "You did the right thing," nothing else. No autograph request, no selfie request, no speech, just 4 words. Jack appreciated that. The plane landed in Chicago at 8:14 a.m. The tires touched the runway with a gentle bounce. Several passengers applauded. Nobody could tell whether they were celebrating the landing or the end of a very strange morning, possibly both. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, people began gathering bags from overhead compartments. Phones reappeared. Seatbelts clicked open. The familiar chaos of arrival returned. Arthur remained seated, not because he was slow, because standing while carrying the box had become difficult. His joints were stiff. His back hurt. His energy had disappeared hours ago. Grief weighs nothing, yet somehow it makes everything heavier. Shaq noticed. Of course he noticed. He stood beside Arthur's row after most passengers had already exited. "Need a hand?" Arthur looked up, then toward the battered brown suitcase resting beneath the seat. The luggage had clearly survived several decades and at least 2 presidents. "Probably." Shaq smiled. "That's what I figured." He lifted the suitcase effortlessly. The old man carefully secured the oak box against his chest. Together they joined the final group leaving the aircraft. Passengers waiting in the jet bridge stepped aside instinctively. Not because of Shaq, because of Arthur. People had witnessed enough to understand that the box mattered. The terminal buzzed with its usual morning energy. Rolling suitcases, coffee orders, flight announcements, business travelers speed-walking toward meetings they probably didn't want to attend. The ordinary noise felt strangely comforting. Life continued, it always did. Arthur walked slowly. Shaq matched his pace without mentioning it. That detail mattered more than either man acknowledged. Fast people rarely understand how exhausting slow days can be. Near a large window overlooking the runway, Arthur stopped briefly. The rain had ended. Sunlight was finally breaking through the clouds. The timing felt almost suspicious. She loved airports. Arthur said it suddenly. Shaq looked over. "Miriam?" Arthur nodded. She wasn't normal. A faint smile appeared. "Most people get stressed at airports." He adjusted the box slightly. "Miriam liked watching people." Shaq laughed. "That's dangerous." Arthur smiled too. "She used to make up stories about everyone." "What kind of stories?" Arthur pointed toward a businessman hurrying through the terminal. "She would have decided that guy secretly owns a llama farm." Shaq laughed louder. Now Arthur was laughing too. The sound surprised both of them. It had been a while. A long while. The old machinist looked down at the oak box. "She would have liked you." Shaq shook his head. "She never met me." Arthur smiled. Didn't stop her before. For several seconds they simply stood there. Two strangers, one carrying a suitcase, one carrying 43 years of memories. The airport moved around them. Nobody rushed them. Nobody interrupted. Eventually they resumed walking. Near baggage claim, Arthur slowed again. His connecting transportation waited outside. Shaq's driver was waiting elsewhere. The journey was ending. The realization settled quietly between them. Arthur looked up. "I never thanked you." "You don't have to." "I know," Arthur nodded. "Still going to." The old man extended his hand. This time somebody accepted it. Shaq carefully shook it. Arthur's grip wasn't strong. It didn't need to be. Some gestures carry their own weight. "You protected my wife." The words nearly broke him, not because they were dramatic, because they were sincere. For Arthur, Miriam wasn't a box. Wasn't ashes, wasn't a memory, she was still his wife. Present tense. Always present tense. Shaq understood. More than people realized. He glanced toward the oak box, then toward the crowded terminal around them. For most of his life, people had treated his size like a problem. Too tall, too big, too noticeable, too impossible to ignore. A burden, an inconvenience, a spectacle. This morning had reminded him of something different. Size isn't automatically strength. Strength isn't automatically kindness. But when the two meet, something useful can happen. A person can create space, space to breathe, space to grieve, space to be treated like a human being. Shaq leaned down slightly, not because Arthur couldn't hear, because some things deserve a quieter voice. People think giants take up space. Arthur listened. Shaq glanced at the box, then back at the old man. "The good ones make space for other people." Arthur stared at him for a moment, then nodded. Slowly, carefully, like a man placing something valuable into a safe place. Neither said anything else. There wasn't much left to say. Shaq handed over the suitcase. Arthur adjusted the oak box one final time. Then the two men walked in different directions through the terminal. One carrying luggage, one carrying love. And, for the first time since Miriam's final journey began, Arthur no longer felt like he was making that trip alone.